Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Trauma Informed Parent Podcast. I am your co-host, Kat Galda, with my other co-host.
Hi, I am Susie DeYoung. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, we're really excited that you're here. And if you are just joining us or if you're coming back and haven't been here for a while, we are the podcast that focuses on the benefits of hindsight. Susie and I are both parents of children who've experienced trauma. And we are here in kind of a community capacity. And when I say community, I mean just the people all around you, the people all around us who walked with us on that mile while we were working with our children, maybe people who themselves have experienced trauma and are trying to raise kids who've also been experienced traumatic events. So
Exactly.
this is a place to come to get real life experience, wisdom, and the best practice and research knowledge that we can find to help you on your journey. So we're
Yep.
really,
And while there are plenty of books and plenty of experts out there, there's nothing really more valuable sometimes than shared experience and real life learned experience, which both Catherine and I have had, both in terms of having our own childhood traumas and raising kids with significant traumas. So we want to bring that to you today. And that's why Catherine said, this podcast will be somewhat a gift of hindsight.
yes, yes, learn from us, right? Learn from the things we did well and maybe not so well. So today's podcast, we're really going to be focusing on what it is to be a trauma survivor who's parenting traumatized young people. So
Yep.
all of the focus today is really going to be looking at how we filter our own experience, what worked, what didn't, and this may end up being a two-parter, right, Susie? I mean,
It might.
yeah,
Hmm.
we don't know. We're going to take and see where this goes, and so we hope that you enjoy. Please, we are glad you're here, and hope that if you have any questions, you reach out to us either through the Facebook page or through Trauma Informed. What's our
Trauma-informed-parent@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. So Susie, do you want to start us off? Do you want to
Sure, yeah. I think we should briefly outline, our own histories and what, we experienced as kids that led to, that impacted our own parenting and in a nutshell, really, because otherwise that could take its own podcast in itself. But I grew up in a home where there was significant substance abuse and significant domestic abuse. Something that today may even have been referred to DCF, but Department of Children and Families, but back then really was not so much being done. So there was a lot of chaos, some violence, some love too, a lot of love, but unfortunately, the mixture of those things can be very confusing for a young child.
Oh my gosh, yes. I'm similar to you, right? What you described is that experience of early childhood trauma, which is not necessarily continuous, but kind of intermittent, but happens over many, many years. I was the same way. My life started one way and ended up another way. My first traumatic experience was the sudden loss of my mother when I was 6, and from that period of time, when my father remarried, he remarried a woman with a pretty significant mental illness, um, and my home became an unsafe place. So, like Susie and I have talked about offline, I went from being a wanted child to being unwanted, which was very difficult to grapple with. And I, like you, Susie, emotional, psychological, verbal abuse, some sexual abuse in the context of the home. So growing up in my home environment was definitely unpredictable and really scary at times. And I developed a lot of adaptive and maladaptive, it depends on
Hmm.
how you look at it, ways of coping. And that's one of the things that I think is important for us as we're going through this pod to talk about is like, kind of what helped you and what didn't, and how does that show up, how did that show up in your adult life and maybe impact
Exactly.
your parenting, right?
Yes, that is something I think is important to touch on because for me, my sister was not born until I was 12, so I was an only child for the first 12 years of my life. So my coping mechanisms involved going inward, involved a lot of play, fantasy play with dolls and creating my own inner world that worked for me. I mean, I did have good friends, but I did not lean on them with this. We didn't talk about these kind of things. So that was over there, but coping mechanism would have been just kind of disappearing into my own void, which works fine when you're alone. But once you start going into the workplace and needing to interact with other people, it can get in the way. And I even got fired from one early job because it was just so hard for me to focus on what was being in the moment reality because I was always drifting off or in another, going off into my own little fantasy world. So that's, an example of a coping mechanism that can work sometimes, but
Hmm.
as you get older, it doesn't work so well anymore.
Yeah,
And
and would you be
underneath
going?
that is anxiety and go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you. Were you like going back into the past a lot, or jumping into the future, or just in a different, not in a different reality, but in a reality that was other than what was taking place right now?
Other than, yeah, yeah, both a mixture of past, future, and, oh, who I'd want to date or what I want for dinner or, just thoughts that would just take me out of the moment because the moment growing up was scary and I hadn't learned yet that the moment at the moment was actually safe. Um, so it took, some severe anxiety attacks and panic attacks to get me into therapy and start working through all that. But the coping mechanisms, they'll always come up as an adult. And if you get through the ones you're using in your job, then you go and you have kids and you find you're using new ones that you need to address. So
Yeah,
it
well, I think you
was,
bring up a good point that, like, I know for me, it's like I came out of my early development with a lot of hypervigilance and hyperarousal and hyperawareness. So all the hyper and fill in the blanks, right?
mhm,
So I was constantly kind of assessing for safety, assessing people, trying to figure out, like, is this safe, unsafe? Is it okay, not okay? So a lot of time kind of, I won't say it was wasted, but it was wasted, right? I mean,
mhm,
when I was out of the context of the abusiveness and unpredictability of my home, I didn't need to be hyper aware and hyper aroused and hyper everything all the time.
mhm,
So, coming into adulthood, um, I would get stuck a lot with those kind of activated periods of time in my life
mhm,
where, it was like anxiety and worry and concern, a little bit like you, not so much of the fantasy, but just kind of developing a way of being that again didn't really work
mhm.
because I spent so much time with energy going outward, trying to look at what was going on in my environment that again, like what was going on here in this
Yep.
present moment?
Right.
Woo!
So I think what's important to bring to people who might be watching this, to parents and caregivers, is, a lot of us did some work before we had kids, which was good and very, very helpful. Um, and having kids in and of itself without that kid having trauma is difficult enough when you've had trauma in your past. But both of us, and I'm sure many of you out there, have then had kids who have suffered either one or many traumas. And that is something Catherine and I have been through. And I think we should touch on, what happened with each of our kids and
Sure.
um, then get
Yeah,
into how we've dealt with that. You want to start?
sure. You went first last time, so it's only fair, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so when I was married and had kids, as Susie said, right? I had done some of my own work, so I was in a pretty good place, right? I was pretty stable. I was coping well. I wasn't acting out all over the place or doing anything that was detrimental to me or other people. I'd finally thought, like, yes, I have this licked, right? I'm in a good place. And I have kids. I have two children, and I'm a working psychotherapist. And in 2012, was the Sandy Hook school shooting. And my eldest child is a survivor of that experience. And that that changed the entire trajectory of our lives. It absolutely has. And you know, They have gone through lots of changes, developmentally. We have all the normal changes going on, but at 7, we have this terrible trauma and the associated nightmares and anxiety and the symptoms that come after that. But then there were more symptoms in adolescence, which I anticipated as a therapist. I understood that would
Hmm.
happen, but I wasn't ready for how it showed up.
Hmm.
Right. And I'll tell you that even to this day, we're still working through that every day. Um, it's a little different all the time, and it's not terrible. It's fine. We're okay.
Hmm.
But there's almost a constant awareness for me and a balancing that needs to take place. So it's like what's happening right here and right now, normal developmental processes, separation and individuation, we're doing our things, living life, going to college. But underneath the surface of that, there's all these other things going on, and that's really hard to juggle. I don't know if it was that way for you, Susie, but it's definitely been that way for us. And now, understanding too that as you listen to this and listen to our stories, our particular types of trauma, we're seeing different types, right? We're seeing early childhood trauma in Susie and I. And then for my family, we have a single episode mass traumatic event.
Hmm.
So that too, that's different than trauma that we find coming out of foster care
Yes.
or medical trauma or different types. So I just want to put that out there before I kick it back over to you, Susie, because I want people
Hmm.
to just be mindful that
Yes.
what we're talking about is specific to us and not necessarily translatable across
True.
all things.
Yes. Although the word can be a little overused lately, there is a difference in trauma, like you said, coming from the foster care system, trauma related to an accident, trauma related to neglectful parents. Those things are all traumatic, and how one child experiences one of these things may be very different than how another child does. A
Mhm.
divorce to one child could be a bump in the road, to another they could have symptoms of trauma. So it's helpful to understand what the word really means and to recognize signs and symptoms.
Yeah, seriously, it's so overused and
It
means
is overused.
it's
Yeah.
like a big giant umbrella, or maybe it's a
Yes.
garbage can, right?
It
Dump
is
it all
for
in.
any stress, and
Yeah.
stress is a great thing and should be experienced by everyone. It's part of being alive, and it tends to be a little overused, but that's another podcast episode, I guess.
I just heard like 10 podcasts right there. So we have plenty of grist for the mill, right?
We do,
But
yes.
Susie, talk to us a little bit about your experience.
So yes. So my son had a very serious traumatic accident in 2004 when he was 7 years old. It was on Halloween, and we were trick-or-treating. He was wearing a costume from the Lord of the Rings called a Dark Rider, which was a black flowy costume with long, very long flowy sleeves. And we had hit about 100 houses. Halloween is a big deal in Newtown, Connecticut, and they wanted to do one more. So we stopped at our neighbors on the way home, and our neighbor had a smoke machine on their porch,
Mhm.
and the smoke machine was illuminated by some votive candles underneath it. And my son wanted to feel what the cool fog air felt like, so he ran his hand through that air, and the sleeve got too close to one of the candles and ignited. And our neighbor put the flames out with his hands. He got pretty seriously burned, and so did my son on his lower face, third-degree burns, and on his left hand. And he was on life support for about 2 days. He made it through that, but that was followed by excruciating skin graft surgeries and other surgeries. And he went back to school to first grade. Well, he was in the hospital for a month, came home, went back to school the following semester, January, wearing a compression shield on his face to help minimize scarring. The doctor came and talked to the first graders to let them know what to expect and what it was, which was great. That helped reduce any excessive questions or,
Mhm.
teasing or whatever. But it was still incredibly difficult. And he was an unwitting celebrity. The accident received a lot of media attention, both local and national. It was on CNN, and locally, he became the little boy that was burned on Halloween, which was not easy for him. He was already struggling with some learning disabilities, nothing serious, but learning disabilities, and he was a quirky little boy, and this just added to the fact that he already felt a little different. So yeah, that was quite an intense period.
Susie, every time I hear that story, and obviously it's not the first time, it like makes my gut clench that you all had to go through all of that, and that, for a boy who what I'm because I didn't know you at that point in our lives, but for a boy who didn't really want to be seen as being different, now is nationally seen as being different, right?
Exactly.
Um,
Yes.
and
And the word trauma wasn't as used as it is today. It wasn't in the lexicon, actually, even though it's overused these days. I think it's almost better than having it never be used because his medical care was excellent. So it was like, oh, he got through that. We're going to get back to normal now. The doctors were great. And nobody ever mentioned, well, what PTSD could look like, or that this could be traumatic. I mean, the doctor was somewhat trauma informed without using the word, like the fact that he went and talked to the other school kids.
yeah,
And
that's great.
yeah, and that he said to my son, that he sat down and talked to him about how my son might want to respond to people who asked him what happened, which happened everywhere we went. And my son had said, I want to tell him it's none of their business. And the doctor was like, all right, let's come up with a kinder, gentler way to say, I don't want to talk about that. And so that was great. But there was no mention of the word trauma, and a lot of the symptoms, I would have better recognized, especially the ones that started years later, if we hadn't looked at it as, oh, he's medically fine, then everything's fine.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that so much, because that's kind of in the evolution of the treatment of trauma. That was where we were. I mean, we knew a lot about, we being the psychological community. We think about veterans, and we think about battered women, and we think about all these different populations, but we weren't really applying that to things like medical trauma, right?
Right,
Accident
right.
medical trauma. And so and what I'm kind of hearing there is like, well, everybody told us it was just, life was going to go back to normal eventually, right? All the surgeries are over, things are, and we'll just kind of be moving through.
Mhm.
Um, and, you know, fast forward to our family's trauma, right? Where trauma is now is in the process of being overused, and everything is a trauma. So now we have much more information, and you're looking, and everything is traumatic.
Mhm. Right, right.
It's like, okay, well, no, not everything is traumatic. Nothing is traumatic. It's not supposed to all go back to being just completely normal, and it's not going to be devastating depending
Hmm.
upon what you do with it,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
And I think that's a really important point to make, is that we as parents, caregivers, whatever, grandparents, we have an instrumental role. We can't
Mhm.
control everything, but we have an instrumental role in helping our children and ourselves and the other people in our house through these experiences.
Yes, and yeah, like you said, ourselves, and what we touched on earlier in regard to how our own childhood trauma impacts our parenting or our coping mechanisms. I mean, that really kicked in after my son's accident because I handled it great. People were calling me Superwoman. I did not cry at all. My husband did, but I didn't. And what it was, which I didn't really realize at the time, was something I was very familiar with, and that's depersonalization, or you
Hello
know,
again, right?
exactly, disassociation.
Yep.
I learned that really well in childhood, and I was an expert in it. So when that happened to him, that kicked in, that just ignited, and I was handling the doctors, the nurses, the hospital, him, and without, any tears, I still was exercising in the morning before I went to the hospital. It was like, and I met another mom in the hospital whose daughter had had her hand and arm seriously burned. And the mom was just struggling just to get there, to get out of a chair, to stop crying. And I remember thinking, why am I feeling this so differently from her? But I didn't see it as my coping mechanisms kicking in at the time. Now I see that. And it was 6 months later that I kind of cracked. Everything came crashing down with intense anxiety attacks and needing some medication. So in hindsight, what I would say to people who might be dealing with that now is, if you're handling it really well, it's probably uh, a coping mechanism. And whereas, I couldn't have changed the or the depersonalization part, that felt physiological, like that. I wasn't going to make myself cry or make myself fall apart. But what I would have done differently, if I know what I know now, is started getting like talking about it with a therapist sooner and looking at little like bodily signs that were happening, and maybe step back a little and let other people have handled it, so that when it did hit, it wasn't such a flood of
Yeah.
feelings, because then I couldn't really cope at all. And luckily I had a good support system. So you want to catch it before it becomes to a point where you can't function.
Yeah. So I think what I hear is being self-aware, right? And self-regulating and mindfulness, right? Those things. And I have to say it's the same for me, right? I didn't have the same experience as you, but I went into a different kind of like superhero role, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was taking care of my family and I was going to make sure that everybody was going to be okay and I was going to take care of my community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's 27,000 people that live in Newtown and I could do that, right?
Yep.
I was a trauma therapist, from the 90s who's on sabbatical raising her kids. And I'm like, oh wait, I have skills. I can do something. I can help. And I'm gonna help, damn it. And it was great. I mean, that's where Susie and I met, for all those of you who don't know that. That's how
Yep.
we came to know each other and become friends. And fast forward, here we are. Um, but so one of the takeaways for me too is for me, I got more and more into community recovery,
Mm-hmm.
right? And working and doing and being all things to all people. So, in a sense, not dealing with my own stuff to help the community, right? Which is very similar to my own
Yes.
early childhood trauma of hypervigilance, hyperawareness, hyperarousal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, but I was able to, you know, in a sense, kind of use those skills for good. Where I didn't take care of myself well was in being overextended.
Yep.
Right? Just
Yep.
too many things, too many people, and trying to do too much.
Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And
Exactly.
unfortunately, sometimes it takes learning that from experience, but
Yeah.
I guess that's what we're here to to say, watch out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can handle a ton. We can work through things and get through things. But I think that, if I'm looking back in hindsight, it's like really focusing every day I do this when I get up in the morning. Like, how do I want to show up in the world today? That's the question I ask myself before I get out of bed. How do I want to show up in the world today? And I use that, and I'm not saying it's perfect or anything, but I use that as a tool or a mechanism to be able to kind of assess, okay, what kind of energy do I have today? What
Hmm.
do I need to be taken care of? Right? Is this a day that needs to be focused inward on self and recognizing where I am? Is this a day when I have the room enough and time to help others?
Hmm.
Um, and that's
Nice.
kind of, yeah, it's been
Yeah.
working well. I'll keep you guys posted.
Yeah, I like that. I did not have that kind of thing back then. So
Yeah.
so that's good. And I guess also with our kids, like I said, trauma wasn't in the language back then. um we knew enough to seek therapy. We knew enough to get a counselor. We called her a feelings doctor. And he took one visit to her. Actually, we were trying different ones out, and the first one we went to, he opened up, he cried, he shared the experience, he shared how mad he was about it. And then we thought, all right, well, we need to keep this up, and we found one that we liked better than this one. And he said, where are we going? I said, a feelings doctor. He said, I already did that. And we got to this next doctor, and he had nothing to say other than like talking about, sports and food and school. And like, I'm not talking about that. I did it. Wasn't around back then, or if it was, we didn't know about it, were therapies such as play therapy, music therapy. Um, oh gosh, music, play. What else is there? Um, there's
Sand
one I'm
tray,
forgetting about. Yeah, sand trays, stuff like that, where you don't
art.
talk about it, but you indirectly like
Mhm.
play it out with make instruments and that's the kind of thing I would have definitely I wish was more available back then and now is available to people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so available that sometimes, it's really interesting as we were talking, Susie. It's like there's two pictures going on. There's the before trauma was and child trauma was something that was really dealt with, and then after it was recognized and kind of got all sorts of stuff because we have an absence of resources and then we have too many resources, right?
Right. Right.
And so how do you pick? So in our story, right, we did play therapy first, which lasted about 3 months. It wasn't long after the Sandy Hook experience. Good therapist got her kid right into therapy, making sure everything's okay and going to be okay, and that worked great. For a good amount of time. Things were pretty stable, and there wasn't anxiety, and we could go to school, and there was no stomach aches and no, difficult behavior. So I was like, cool, great, this is wonderful. And then it just kind of wasn't going away. Avoidance, insecurity, anxiety. So we ended up trying TFCBT, so trauma focused
Hmm.
cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the frontline therapy at the time for children who've experienced, who've lived through or experienced trauma.
Wow.
And it was about, it was really about skill development and writing this book, writing the narrative of the experience.
Hmm.
And, that was really helpful. It wasn't fun
Hmm.
vis-a-vis. I had to use bribery and promise that we would go to Cumberland Farms after therapy in order to,
Uh-huh.
but I figure, it could be a lot worse. So,
Uh-huh.
um, but we were able to go through that experience, and that really did the trick in terms of being able to have a place to put this experience in
Mm.
the larger picture of my child's life.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
Now, that doesn't mean we haven't had bumps and we don't have things now, and we don't, there won't be things in the future.
Hmm.
But I think, for us, one of the important takeaways was we all have suffering, we all have traumatic experience, and it isn't that we know how we're going to get knocked on our butts,
Right.
but what we do when we're there. Right?
Yes.
You get to choose
Yes.
that piece. And as
Yes.
parents, we don't have all the choice, but we are instrumental in being able to help there.
Yes. And I think the other people in our lives need to be instrumental as well if they can. And if it's possible for them to know that, your child's history, it helps even more because, people will always say, well, I know my child and I'll know if something's wrong. But that's not always the case. I was a stay-at-home parent and I knew him very, very well, but at least I thought I did. But I found out in fourth grade well, I found out later that I didn't know him as well in fourth grade as I thought I did. He
Mhm.
had a teacher who had given an assignment to the class to write to their future selves in the beginning of the year, whatever their wish was for themselves at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, she gives them back their letters. Well, she never gave him back his letter and never told us about his letter because he had written some dark things. He had written to himself, I hate you. I wish you were dead. Stuff like that. And to protect us, she never gave us the letter. And at home, he was pretty much doing well. A lot of friends, a happy kid. Not that happy in school, but we switched schools that year to a smaller one for learning disabilities that he did like. So we didn't know he was having the depression. A depression was starting then. And we ran into her years later. I think he was
Mhm.
like 16 at a funeral for a mutual friend. And she took me aside then and
Oh
told me,
boy.
yeah, about the letter. And I think she was very young. And I think she had gotten a little older and realized that might not have been the smartest move.
Yeah,
Um, so I think teachers, coaches, babysitters, whoever need to know to look out because had I known that then we would have sought out therapy sooner
sure.
because when he was an adolescent, it became much more clear that the trauma, but it was obviously there earlier. He was struggling internally with feelings of shame and sadness.
Yeah. Well, and again, as always, Suze, you bring up the right topic at the right time, right? Having, we talk about recovery for our kids. We're talking about it's because it's not just us as parents, it's the grandparents, it is the teachers and the coaches and the music teachers, if they're art kids, it is all of the instrumental adults in a young person's life that can have,
Even the dentist,
oh my gosh,
when
I
my
never would
son
have thought
had this hit me, he
that.
had his wisdom teeth out when he was 15,
Mhm.
and the dentist just haphazardly prescribed like 20 Vicodin.
Oh
And
my gosh.
when you've had trauma, you are more at risk for substance abuse.
Sure.
And I think as a professional, it's up to us as parents, I guess, to let these professionals know. But there might be a ding ding there of maybe I should start with the Tylenol or start with three of them. But just
Mhm.
so that's a circle of support
Mhm.
around this young person.
Yeah. And maybe you're bringing up for me, maybe we don't do a good enough job in medical care in understanding a person's history,
Yeah,
right? Because
exactly.
those kind of mistakes or errors happen a lot,
Yes.
and wreak havoc on people's lives.
Yep,
Um,
exactly.
so I think if 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 I'm getting to have kind of not a last word, but things you should think about, things you should do is really, letting the community of adults know. Not, it doesn't have to be a ton of detail, but enough information so that they can be on the lookout.
Right,
Because what we know is that it isn't always mom and dad that kids go to when they're suffering and they're struggling. It just isn't, right?
right,
It's fear, maybe of getting in trouble or not wanting to disappoint or, something that's
right,
holding them back from being able to come to us. Um, and maybe they're telling their coach, and we need to know that, right?
right.
We need that information. So coming around, as a kind of community to respond. Um,
Yes, and understanding signs of trauma that you might not, when my son was having intense trouble concentrating, we thought, oh, maybe his ADD. I didn't know that was also a symptom of trauma. It's also a symptom of ADD, so you need to figure out. But if they've had trauma, that could be, part of it. And we didn't think of that at the time. So it's understanding, how trauma may manifest is not always in crying or depression, or it can be in lack of concentration, or it can be in risk-taking behaviors.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think we need to go back and do another pod about that.
yes. So, yeah, what do we want to leave people with in terms of,
Mhm.
uh, being parents who have had our own traumas, parenting kids with trauma. Ultimately, what's the big lesson learned here for you?
Um, I think for me, it's always, put your oxygen mask on yourself first before, right? You have to, when something happens, you need to check in with yourself and you need to, if you haven't gotten any treatment for the traumas of your own life,
Hmm.
get it, right?
Yes.
Whether that is through psychotherapy or body work or, whatever it is that you need to do to heal yourself,
Yep.
get on that right away because you're not going to be able to to be present for your young person in the way that you want to.
Exactly.
Um, and then, if having done that, taking your own inventory regularly, figuring out where you're at and taking a moment to be mindful and insightful and look at and think about where you are in each moment going forward because your stuff is going to come up and you're not going to necessarily know it and it's going to manifest, in some situation in the here and now. And that's fine as long
Hmm.
as it's intentional. That would be my thing,
Right.
right? I'm all about intentionality these days. Like,
Yep.
okay,
And
we
it may manifest, and what manifests may not always be quote unquote unhealthy. Like what we talked
right.
about before, what manifested with me looked like strength and capability, and knowing yourself, be it through therapy or however means helps you get to know yourself. If you can recognize that what's coming out is connected to your coping mechanisms from childhood that may not serve you in long term, that can be
Mhm.
very helpful.
Yeah,
You need to be recognized why you're doing what you're doing.
absolutely. And you're
Yeah.
still gonna miss, right? I miss all the time, but
Oh,
But when
Yeah.
you figure it out, you got to think about it and process it and get help and talk to people that you love and talk to people that you pay and do whatever
Mhm.
it is that you need to do to understand what's going on for you.
And also, kids who have had trauma will sometimes have behaviors that are going to resurrect. Sorry about the difference. They're going to have behaviors that will resurrect some of your old feelings. Like I know, for a while there, my son got very combative with his siblings.
Mhm.
And that was tough to take because all of a sudden things were chaotic and angry. And that brought up memories of my own parents being chaotic and angry, and I would snap or get, start feeling rageful. And
Mhm.
it's just so helpful to be able to say, my sister used to always say, if you're hysterical, it's historical. And
I love that.
that was helpful because their trauma will ignite, resurrect your trauma in some ways, or the helplessness you felt as a child. If you can't help them, it's important to find coping mechanisms. For me, that ended up being therapy, yoga, and meditation were very helpful. And some meditation, not meditation, medication as well. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Heard and understood. I think that might be another pod in and of itself,
Yes.
going back and looking at triggers,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
I think so. This
But
has been great.
this is good.
I think that I think we've gotten to the end,
I
right?
think we have. If anyone has any further questions or comments or want to share your story, just email traumainformedparent@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, we would.
But
We'll
thank you,
be back.
Kat.
Thank you, Susie. And we'll be back really soon with our next episode. We appreciate you and definitely please leave us comments, suggestions. If you have topics that you would like to hear more about, we would love to take that on and
Yep.
explore with you. So please feel free to get back with us.
Yep.
We're so excited. We'll see you
Bye
next.
bye.
Bye.